the KliK Foundation, Misha Klaassen, and we are really happy to be able to have an excellent panel and also a huge participation, at least in terms of registrations. This is by far the biggest event that the Zurich Carbon Market Association has ever hosted in its more than 10 years of history. So it seems that everyone is really eager to discuss this topic. So before getting into the content, a few housekeeping announcements. So please mute yourself at all times unless you want to take the floor. Please don't use the chat other than for urgent technical questions, because we don't want to have two parallel streams of action in this workshop. After each presentation, I will invite clarification questions, but pure clarification. The general debate will come afterwards. So please use your virtual hands for such questions. Then once everyone is through among the presenters, we'll open for the general discussion, and there we would invite everyone who has an input also to show her or his face. And we will record this webinar, and we'll also share the slide sets because, yeah, we want to be really transparent. So with regard to our lineup, we have an excellent lineup representing key actors in the field we discussed today. So we'll start with Sana Ligorski from UNFCCC to give us background on CDM and voluntary markets, followed by Owen Hewlett from Gold Standard. Many of you have seen announcement of the gold standards regarding how they see the voluntary market to develop. Then we will have Misha from KliK, our co-hosts, to discuss the Article 6 compliant mitigation activities. And of course, KliK is a key player in the compliance market, so I'm really looking forward to that. Followed by Patrick Hofstetter from WWF. Those of you who are in Switzerland know that Patrick has been a key voice in climate policy for a very long time. So yeah, this is something I'm really also looking forward to. Then we have Jochen Gassner from First Climate, a key provider of voluntary offsets. And last but not least, Jeff Swartz. Many on the Zurich community know he has been in Zurich and working for key actors here. Now he is with BP in London. And of course, yeah, I think he has interesting things to tell us. So before getting into the presentations, I want to set the scene. Because, yeah, the big interest in this topic, of course, shows that we have many burning questions to discuss. And of course, one critical aspect, which of the segments of the international carbon markets is more attractive? Is it the voluntary or the compliance markets? And of course, the answers can be very different depending on the time horizon. Currently, voluntary markets are really the fashion. That one clearly can say. But will this be the case also in the long term? And I think we'll have a very lively discussion on that. A second point that is often evoked is, will these markets be completely disjointed, or will there be a level playing field? And I think Misha will look at this and have some interesting views. And the last critical aspect, of course, is the elephant in the room, the corresponding adjustments. So if voluntary market transactions between countries require corresponding adjustments, what would it mean? And if the negotiations go the way that corresponding adjustments are not needed, how would this change? And of course, we've seen attempts to reframe the voluntary market message that, if it can't be an offset because corresponding adjustments are difficult to get, then we could frame it as a contribution to climate finance. So I think this question could become relevant. I just want to show a small graphic here on some of the key aspects that frame these discussions, because essentially it's a bit about two different government attitudes. We can have a government that is a very laissez-faire government. It has its NDC, but eventually it is not really very strongly engaged in developing policies that mandate companies to do something about mitigation. So under such a government, of course, companies might find the voluntary market extremely attractive because, yeah, they can be a good citizen, they can contribute to mitigation, and then they can still generate voluntary credits. As a contrast, you might have a country that now says, we have our NDC, but we want sure to be able to reach it. And that's why we introduced policy instruments like an ETS. And under this ETS, the companies, of course, have their cap. Some will be exceeding the cap, others will need to buy allowances from those that are better than the cap. But of course, this doesn't really leave the room for voluntary action. And the question is, which of these two forms will prevail? And of course, it can mean that we will see clubs forming. So clubs of countries that have this laissez-faire attitude, and then the VERs will move among these countries, and we might have the club of the strict countries that will want to move ITMOs. And we'll have to see which of these clubs will be bigger. So yeah, just to complete setting the scene. So will we see a movement from the laissez-faire to the strict variety as the target years for the NDC come closer and the NDCs might become politically more salient? That, of course, would mean the future for the voluntary markets might not be that rosy. Or will we see the stampede that we currently have seen in certain sectors, big private players, especially in Europe? Will they continue this stampede towards corporate net zero targets and become more ambitious than the governments in their NEC? That, of course, would be a bright future for the voluntary carbon markets. So we have to see which of these futures will we get. And then, of course, we have this thorny question of the different scopes in the corporate net zero targets. And this, of course, normally is not really in line with the ways we calculate emissions under the international climate policy regime. So if, for example, we have scope 3 targets that address the entire value chain, that will influence emissions in other countries, that could, on the one hand, be a driver to move laggards, so governments who don't have a serious NDC forward. But we would have an interesting outcome that if such targets proliferate in the context of insetting of companies, then we'll have windfall benefits for those countries in the value chain. And yeah, this might be really an interesting aspect to discuss. So with that, I would like to finalize my short setting the scene. And I would now invite Sana to give her presentation on voluntary aspects, markets, CDM cancellation. Sana, you have the floor.
Good afternoon from Bonn. Thank you, Axel. I hope you can hear me well.
Perfect, yes.
Thank you for the opportunity to join this event and to share some of our experience and market analysis. It's really remarkable, actually, how many of us can come so flexibly, quickly together at such a low emissions impact. I really enjoy that. So I will talk about the UNFCCC mechanisms, the CDM in particular, and also I will share some remarks on Article 6 in the context of voluntary markets. And I will start, if we can have the first slide, please. I will start by outlining the relationship between the UNFCCC mechanisms and the voluntary markets. Then I'll move to Article 6 and how Article 6 negotiation draft texts reflect voluntary use, or rather the use of mitigation outcomes for other purposes, before going a little deeper into a few metrics and patterns of voluntary cancellation in the context of the CDM. So by voluntary cancellation, I mean the act of moving offsets to a cancellation account and thus claiming the mitigation value of the offset. So I will be using some terms interchangeably, but I hope it will be clear enough. So can we have the next slide, please? So let me recall that in the context of the Kyoto Protocol, the voluntary cancellation was enabled from the outset of the implementation of the Kyoto regime. And it was enabled in national registries of Annex 1 parties. all Kyoto unit types can be cancelled for voluntary purposes, including the offsets from the CDM and JI, the two market mechanisms providing flexibility in compliance. While voluntary cancellation in relation to GI has been very low, we're talking here just about over 25 million ERUs or emission reduction units for commitment period 1 and just over 2 million for commitment period 2, which essentially carry over. CERs from the CDM cancelled for voluntary cancellation total to over 200 million today. So this is quite some significant amount. As voluntary cancellation of CERs was already common in commitment period 1, voluntary cancellation in the CDM registry, the mechanism registry, was only enabled in 2012 by the CMP, and it has picked up significantly since then. And its use has gradually come to demonstrate more diversified purposes. It may be also useful to note that while voluntary cancellation was tied into the Kyoto accounting system, its purpose have not been always closely tracked and monitored. So what I'm trying to say is that we don't really have a very accurate understanding of the uptake of voluntary cancellation. Voluntary cancellation was simply a pathway to claiming the mitigation outcomes by project participants. And to underscore this point, I'll just say that the national registries in the Kyoto regime and the CDM registry implemented different procedures and practices, including with respect to reporting on those voluntary cancellation actions, which has been posing some challenges in the analysis of the historic use. With regard to voluntary use of mitigation outcomes, this topic has found its way in Article 6 negotiations, so I'm trying to make the transition now. But only some aspects have crystallized in the negotiation texts, with some new dimensions, broadly termed under the umbrella use of mitigation outcomes for other purposes. Of course, this is well expected, as I've just mentioned. There has been a significant uptake of voluntary cancellation in Kyoto, and this has been recognized in the Article 6 negotiations. Another aspect with respect to the terminology used in Article 6 is the term of other international mitigation purposes. So other purposes, other international mitigation purposes is what we commonly see in the Article 6 draft text. So let's look briefly in the relevant textual elements of 6.2 and 6.4. 6.2 relating to the voluntary cooperation among parties through market instruments, and 6.4 being the Article 6 offset mechanism. I just assume that most of you are familiar with Article 6, so please forgive me the use of acronyms. So looking at other uses in 6.2 text, the first point I want to bring up is that authorization, party authorization, is part of the 6.2 rule base of the Paris Agreement, and the latest presidency text from Madrid includes authorization covering situations where the mitigation outcome might be used for other purposes than NDC use, with or without international transfer. Other purposes and international mitigation purposes is not defined, and other purposes as determined by the authorizing parties. So as we have heard in the negotiations in the rooms, other purposes appears to relate to everything other than NDC use, from the use of from the use for other multilateral regimes like CORSIA, to pure voluntary cancellation use of mitigation outcomes and internationally transferred mitigation outcomes such as corporate ESG. So there is also a requirement in Article 6 for the first transferring authorizing party to correspondingly adjust for the mitigation outcomes. And this means that parties will be required to add a number of the mitigation outcomes that they authorize for other purposes to their emission inventory number. And this is really a new aspect that we recognize under Article 6 in the way the accounting rules are going to be tied together and cover other uses of mitigation outcomes. Also relevant to note in 6.2 is that parties involved in transactions where the use is other purposes need to report need to report, including the manner in which the ITMOs, so the mitigation outcomes, because I'm talking about domestic use, the manner in which this other purposes has been taken up. So with respect to 6.4, which is the mechanism, voluntary cancellation, also for unspecified use, has been also drafted into the text and has been settled for quite some time. It seems likely that parties participating in the mechanism and the project participants that they will authorize can voluntarily cancel 6.4 units for any reason in the 6.4 registry. And it can be assumed that they may have at least the same functionality the CDM has, and possibly more. The draft decision text from Madrid requests the mechanism supervisory body to develop provisions for voluntary cancellation. So again, in 6.4, we have very little detail related to voluntary cancellation or the uptake of mitigation outcomes for other purposes. So this is the status at the end of Madrid, and the accounting for ITMOs and mitigation outcomes for other purposes remains pretty much in informal discussions this year. So I think it will take until the next COP until we can hear formal positions with that regard. Can we move to the next slide, please? So now turning a little bit back to the history, and specifically the experience on CDM in the voluntary market, I will only take a few minutes here to share information on volumes and some of the patterns that we think are valuable. On this slide, we show how voluntary cancellation has been used in national registries of Annex 1 parties and in the CDM registry. The CDM registry accounts just for about a quarter of all voluntary cancellation. And the voluntary cancellation pathway has been taken up by several domestic compliance schemes, in addition to various governmental and international financial institution carbon pricing initiatives or carbon market support initiatives, alongside the more traditional use of voluntary cancellation for corporate social responsibility or voluntary action by individuals. So this slide is not accurate representation. We're just plotting for you some of the main uses that we have seen across the CDM registry and national registries. So moving to the next slide, please. What I think it's probably also relevant to appreciate here is that the CDM market is obviously not uniform, and the CDM market as such for voluntary purposes is not uniform. Market segments for particular uses have emerged as an example of market fragmentation. Also, to some degree, the CDM has fulfilled the function of indirect linking between domestic and regional markets. To what extent the CDM has fulfilled such purpose is not something that we have looked deeply into, but obviously the CDM has supplied units for compliance grades in Annex 1 parties, but also for compliance grade regimes in as we see them emerging in non-Annex 1 parties. So zooming into the voluntary cancellation now, specifically only in the CDM registry, we show on this slide the historic voluntary cancellation on the left-hand side, and on the other side is just a slice of 2020, just to see the comparison. We started to notice that the uptake amongst the domestic compliance schemes of cancellation of CERs for the African carbon tax, for example, in 2020 is now more prominent. So again, the lion's share of voluntary cancellations in the CDM registry relate to these domestic schemes. And among the other reasons, we also see the uptake of another tool that the CDM registry has launched in 2015, which is the voluntary cancellation platform. I wanted to share a few comments on the voluntary cancellation platform, which is essentially a service of the CDM registry, which provides the opportunity for the purchasing of CERs for immediate voluntary cancellation online. And I thought it might be relevant because this tool is explicitly mentioned in Corsia, but in the interest of time, I'll skip that. I'll just wrap it up by saying that on this slide at the bottom, you can see how the voluntary cancellation has gradually grown in uptake from 2012 to 2020. And if we can skip the next slide and go directly to the last slide, I just want to show you a slice of the sectors that have the next slide one. This is just the next one is just showing a slice of the different sectors that have sourced CERs for voluntary cancellation in this period from 2012 onwards. Maybe just a final remark on what we have seen with respect to voluntary cancellation in the CDM registry as taken up by corporations and organizations. We noticed that obviously there is a growing interest among private entities to demonstrate their environmental responsibility through offsetting. But we have also noticed, and that they will take action as long as they have adequate tools to access the market, which obviously remains a challenge. So we see a lot of interest through the voluntary cancellation platform in that respect. But we also notice that in the context of those voluntary action by organizations and individuals, the MRV aspect remains a challenge. MRV is obviously an expensive thing to have, and many of those voluntary actions have, in one or another way, we have come to understand that those actors need a more full package, if you wish, of tools to enable their participation in the voluntary market. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you so much. And of course, we're happy to continue the discussion. Thank you, Axel.
Yes, thanks a lot, Sana, for also very interesting data that even seasoned market observers have not seen before in such a structured manner. So that's extremely helpful. Do we have any question for clarification to Sana? I'm not seeing any hand right now. So without any further ado, I would now then give the floor to Owen, Gold Standard.
Thanks, Axel. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, perfect.
Super. Well, hi, everybody. Thanks so much to Perspectives and CMA for inviting me. It's lovely to tangentially be involved in something in Zurich, even if I haven't been over for a year now. I wanted to talk a bit about the voluntary side of the equation, and in particular for quality in that space. And I think quality is an important word for us to think about here, because you may have seen through things like the Mark Carney task force that scale seems to be a buzzword right now. And famously, big isn't necessarily better. It's a pretty valueless term unless we put that alongside quality. We are by necessity scaling something that doesn't make any difference. But I think it's also important to unpick the voluntary part as well. So what do we mean by voluntary? Do we mean the voluntary use? Are we conflating that with offsetting? Is it the voluntary issuers like ourselves? We're a voluntary standard, but we also now play in a compliance space. So in an ever increasingly fragmented, diverging set of markets and applications of markets, I think it's important that we navigate our way through that. So I wanted to talk three things. One was around how are we trying to bring consistency to that kind of morass of use cases? What are some of the initiatives that we're using, and how are we thinking about quality? And then what are some of the externalities? What are the things that we can't necessarily deal with when we think of quality? So if we could go on a slide there, please, Johanna. I won't introduce Gold Standard. I think if you're in Zurich and in a carbon market conversation, you likely know who we are already. But just as a reminder, we issue carbon credits and we label carbon credits. We were originally founded to label carbon credits. If you go back a slide, Johanna, you've got on one there, I think. We've labeled CERs for nearly 20 years. And for most of that 20 years, those were the two use cases. And you could conflate the terms voluntary offsetting and the compliance market, but that's not the case now. So we obviously have, as Sana already pointed out, the country-to-country ITMO transfer, which is an application of markets. We have voluntary offsetting that we've discussed, which is a different but very similar looking application. There's CORSIA as a sectoral compliance scheme. We can expect others. There's domestic compliance schemes like the South Africa carbon tax, and those things matter. So when we think about quality, what I think we mean is a quality carbon credit used correctly in the correct application and talked about right, making the right claim about it. And take that South Africa carbon tax example, if we extrapolate the question that Axel challenged us with at the start, which was about our corresponding adjustments to be realized, or do we need something else? The South Africa carbon tax will use gold standard credits, but it doesn't make sense if you have corresponding adjustments. It's an instrument that the country can't use towards its policy. So either that means it's not an offsetting thing, which is how I would see it, and it's something else, or we need to really unpack these applications, basically. If we go on a slide there, Johanna, something else from the task force report, which you may have read recently, is this kind of viewpoint of creating what they're calling core provisions. So what is the minimum? I use that word a little bit carefully. What's the minimum definition of a carbon credit asset? What are the attributes it must have to act in that market at all? That's the kind of bottom of the column there on the left. Those are the things that we would need to be in place to issue a unit. And those things really need to align with the Paris Agreement to make any sense. So a definition of baseline, a definition of additionality. And then we have the application-driven attributes, and they may change. Like I say, I already pointed the one there around, obviously you need a corresponding adjustment for country-to-country transfers. It doesn't make sense, or the South Africa carbon tax stops making sense if you require one. But it's the same core asset. So what are those application-driven attributes? How should we think about them? And those could be buyer preference, they could be scheme preference, and they could be mandated by the nature of the mechanism. So CORSIA has limited the project types and vintage through choice. The corresponding adjustment is a necessity for that scheme to make any sense. Well, likewise, South Africa will only accept South African projects for obvious reasons. So it's a real variety in that top box, and navigating that will become important. Sorry, if we go on a slide there, please, Johanna, get my words in order. The key for us, I think, is that we don't try and invent a unit or a credit for each of those applications. So we're not going to try and come up with a CORSIA carbon credit and a South Africa carbon credit or any other type of specific carbon credit. Instead, as I say, we'll create the unit that has all the core provisions in order, and then we'll make sense of the attributes that need to change depending on which use case you're going for. And really what I was saying at the start there about what do we mean by voluntary? Is it voluntary use or voluntary issuance or voluntary project? Everything is kind of everything now, I think. If you're a voluntary project, you want to maximize the number of markets you can play in, whether it's general voluntary offsetting or the South Africa carbon tax, if that's where you happen to be, or if you can access the kind of ITMO country to country world. You want all of those things to be available to you, or at least as many as you qualify for. So it doesn't make sense to certify somebody for CORSIA and then prevent them from entering voluntary offsetting markets, for example. So that's a big theme of our work. In terms of how we're going to try and do that, just going around the peacock of key initiatives here, starting on the left. It starts with those core provisions and making them consistent with the Paris Agreement. Traditionally, I think those core provisions are largely driven by the world of CDM. So things like additionality and how to deal with double counting and definitions of baselines and methodologies all come from CDM. And I suspect a lot of the discourse will continue to be that through Article 6.4. So I don't see necessarily an Article 6.4 set of attributes being that different to a voluntary carbon credit necessarily. But there's a lot that we can get on with while we're waiting for those definitions to come through. So dealing with things like our baseline definition, or a simpler one, updating GWP reference values, that kind of thing. We also want to align with science-based targets. So it's not just the Paris Agreement, but it's also about respecting the kind of corporate mitigation hierarchy and correctly placing the use of markets within that hierarchy, whether it's for offsetting or compensating or taking responsibility for emissions beyond your scope 1 and 2 and 3, or it may be market mechanisms that serve scope 3 particularly. I suspect not everybody supports the scope 2 market mechanisms. Having said that, and I suspect Jochen would say similar when we come to him, that only happens with thoughtful transition. What we can't do is strand particularly vulnerable projects, but we also need to show some stability here. It's tempting to say, well, technically the right thing to do is black and white, so we must immediately roll out these rules. And there's a part of me that does like to think like that, but the reality is projects will fail. That's not fair. I mean, sometimes it's probably a good thing if some of the older, not so good projects in carbon markets disappear. That's probably a good thing. But, you know, we have projects in refugee camps. You know, it's not fair to exclude those and suddenly cut off that finance because they can't meet latest provisions. So we have to thoughtfully transition, one, for fairness to projects, but also, you know, we have to show that this works. And so if we want people to align with the Paris Agreement and see something holistic, you know, we have to give people that confidence, and we don't give people confidence by frightening them off. So a thoughtful transition with as much certainty as we can, avoiding stranding assets where we can. Obviously, we're not in full control of that at Gold Standard, but that thoughtful transition is very important to us. We also, you know, to make sense of all of that, to make sense of my sort of column of attributes by use cases of markets, it's really important we talk about the claims in the right way. So claims do matter. You know, we talk about greenwashing sometimes as a sort of generalized concern, but greenwashing is important. My parents just bought something for their house, and they bought it because of the claims made by the company concerning climate. And I didn't have the heart to tell them that it was, you know, garbage. But it matters, right? Like if you greenwash, it affects behavior. That stuff's important. And it also helps us define the attributes of the units we're trying to issue. So that's all, I guess, environmental stuff. We have a big program very close to our heart is also sustainable development integrity. I was really pleased to see both CORSIA and the Carney Task Force talk about safeguarding and inclusivity. We really want to see that done robustly. You know, we're big advocates of aligning with things like UNDP safeguards, IFC safeguards. It seems strange to focus on one program of the UN but not align with others. We also have a kind of ambition to bring those things to the next generation with SDG aligned impact reporting tools for specific project types. We hope over time to also create country overlays so that you'd have a South Africa or maybe a clean cooking, say, SDG impact reporting tool, and at the click of a button that aligns with the South Africa SDG priorities. Yeah, we're not there yet, but that's the direction of travel. And then lastly, just scope-wise, Axel mentioned which project types should we support. So we'll continue to advocate for high development potential projects. That's our priority. We want to see more holistic nature-based solutions, not a rush to say soil carbon, but to really think about things like food security. And then, you know, technology-based removals, clearly something that will come on our agenda as well. So we have scope expansion in mind for that. And if we go on one slide, Johanna, I'm pretty much done. Look out for our transitionary framework platform. So it will affect our rules, both in Gold Standard for the global goals, our flagship standard, but also through thought leadership and advocacy. And I had one more slide on externalities. Maybe if you could just flip that up, Johanna, in my last 20 seconds or so. I think really I can leave that on the screen for everybody to read. I've mentioned Mark Carney and science-based targets. Those are really defining the minimum provisions and the use cases. The other initiative I think is really good and really interesting is EDF, WWF, OCO Institute's carbon credit quality rating system. And I think if we create a minimum provision plus a quality rating system, then we can really push the envelope. And that's what I wanted to share. Thanks so much for listening.
Thanks, Owen. Are there any clarification questions? I'm not seeing any hand up right now, so I'll pass. I see Jay. Jay, you have the floor, please. Jay, we don't hear you.
Yeah, hi.
Yes.
Yeah, good evening, everyone. Hi. So, Owen, one question I had is, what would you do for countries that are not considering corresponding adjustment related provisions? For example, I mean, there could be situations where there's no clarity. The government doesn't have a clear guidance on whether they want to do corresponding adjustment or not. And then we are in the Paris agreement period. So, for instance, an Indian voluntary carbon credit, and like how would you be able to do corresponding adjustment without government provisioning for it? Like, would you have voluntary market-based country registries also? Will there be demarcation that, okay, this is a credit from India, and it of course, whenever the provision will come, it will go for corresponding adjustment, or it is currently not labeled for corresponding adjustment. So whoever is buying that credit cannot transfer it or is transferring it at their own risk. So like, what are your thoughts on these kind of situations where the country regulations are not very clear, but there could be buyer interest, or the developers are obviously there, and they would like requesting issuance. For example, I heard that CDM is not issuing any credits because there's no clarity after 2020. So is there something similar happening under gold standard, or you will just keep issuing credits in 2021, 2022 without any clarity from the government side whether they are doing corresponding adjustment or not doing
Thank
corresponding
you, Jay.
Thanks.
Good. So, Owen?
Yeah, sure. Happy to answer that, Axel. Do you want me to take it now? I know it was one of your kind of key challenge questions, so I'm happy to discuss
Well,
it.
if you want to answer quickly what gold standard envisages to do to address it, and of course, otherwise a generic question could then be referred to
Sure.
that panel discussion.
I'll do the 30 seconds. So I think the first thing is that the use case is really important here. If we're talking about voluntary carbon offsetting, then that either needs to be avoiding double claiming or it doesn't. Now, you could argue it doesn't, or you could argue it does, but what the government feels about it or what the buyer feels about it is irrelevant. It's just a maths question. The second thing I would say is, I think corresponding adjustments anyway aren't going to be neatly happening at the point of issuance. So we're going to have adjusted and unadjusted units and units at various statuses on that journey. So I don't think it's an issuance question. I think it's a use question. So we'll issue the unit, then it will either get its corresponding adjustment or not. And then how it can be used is to be determined. So personally, and what we're thinking at GS is that we need a transitionary period to the point when offsetting universally requires corresponding adjustments. So whether we require that immediately now or it happens in 2023 or 2025, those things are to be debated. But yeah, that's how we're thinking about it.
Thanks, Owen. Good. So I would now invite Misha to give his balancing act between compliance and voluntary. Misha, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you. And Johanna, please show the slides if you can. But they're not visible yet.
Mm.
So, excellent. Yeah, that works. Thank you. So, yeah, thank you. I will try this balancing act, and it's very interesting to see that from the compliance perspective, we are at a quite different stage now, as Owen and has been presenting. We're not like on a transitionary edge, but much more on a very like testing very new grounds. And I'd like to share a few observations on that topic from different perspectives, and I would of course focus on the perspective of the compliance buyer, as the KliK Foundation is currently under the Paris Agreement, and also focusing on the quality requirements or compliance requirements. So we're not talking about quality here, we're talking about requirements, and these requirements flow from a set of legal provisions. Next slide. So this legal framework is very important to understand that the KliK Foundation is operating in under its compliance obligation. And I take it that this is like the generic case. So every compliance buyer under Article 6 will face the same set of legal frameworks governing the transactions. It's not finished with the Paris Agreement and the Paris Rulebook. There is also, at least in the Swiss case, the requirement for bilateral agreements that govern the implementation of Article 6. And under this agreement, there are national regulations. So it's not agreements, it's national regulations that govern the national processes and also requirements, both at the side, in this case of Peru, and also Switzerland. And of course, there are accepted carbon standards and methodologies that accounting will base on. Now, this set of like nested frameworks has implications on what activity types are considered suitable for compliance purposes, how activities are going to be developed, and also what fraction of emission reductions can be accounted for in the transaction. I'd present now very briefly a set of experiences that we gathered, next slide, in this process. And as Axel mentioned, or has been mentioned before, the pink elephant is this corresponding adjustment, which is in the very core of the Article 6 transactions in the compliance, or at least as we see it now in the Swiss context. And corresponding adjustment means that there is a need for the implementation agreement that sets legally binding provisions for both the transferring country and the acquiring country. And this brings about the situation that the transferring country has to manage overselling risk. And by managing also, this already indicates what kind of activities are better suited than other. We have to avoid, at least that's our strategy, avoid measures or sectors that are in tendency addressed by NDC action. So the activities they take, in tendency will take place in rather complex niches, or if they are partly overlapping or fully overlapping with NDC action, there needs to be a split, and this also will come with costs. And of course, there are the implementation of the agreement bears political costs in the transferring country. The country needs to have a very clear understanding of a policy roadmap, and most of the countries are not there yet to really wholeheartedly embark on Article 6 prior to knowing what exactly the policy roadmap consists of. And this, of course, leads to delays and uncertainty in the process. Then the next topic, that's, no, it's still on the slide. The next nexus is the OMG SOP nexus. The question, through the transaction, will there be discounts both at the level of accounted mitigation outcomes or fees or transfer costs, and also with respect to integrity, conservative baseline, conservative factors, etc., will lead to further discounts on the fraction of emission reductions that can be accounted as mitigation outcomes. Then looking at it a bit more closely, if we look at the implementation agreement between Peru and Switzerland, there is a clear adherence to the San Jose principles, and there is a clear no lock-in of fossil fuels, which basically means generally no switch to natural gas. So that's this fuel switch to natural gas is ruled out. So we cannot pursue these kind of activities irrespective of whether or not it's like sensible. It also means no supply side efficiency if fossil fuel is involved. And if we look at demand side efficiency, we cannot go with the heavy fuel oil baseline, which is like real and verifiable, but we most probably would look at the natural gas as a baseline, which is compliant with the Paris Agreement goals. Another element that we are increasingly seeing is that the use of national parameters will be imposed. So, for example, the fraction of non-renewable biomass, which is widely used in voluntary methodologies, will be different because the activities will have to use the official FNRBs that are used in the national communications toward the UN. Same picture for the methane conversion factors, etc. You know that better, but just to be prepared, these factors will be different. They, of course, have also different like perspectives. The ones are overestimating rather than the other are underestimating the factors. Next slide. Now, if I change the perspective to the developer, what should developer think of this? So we are working with developers and trying to encourage them to walk the path of Article 6. They, of course, that was mentioned, they have a variety of markets to be addressed. It's yeah, you know them. And for them, of course, time to market is important. The uncertainty, the probability of the outcome, and of course the volume, the demand volume. What's the volume of demand, and also the willingness to pay of the customers. So this is a picture, and they also probably will ask themselves, well, do we have a good value proposition in compliance markets? So we have a unit that maybe costs 10 times the voluntary unit, and they ask themselves, are they really 10 times more environmentally integer, or the other way around, is the voluntary unit 10 times less integer? So these are the questions the developers may ask themselves. Now, with the first implementation agreement between Switzerland and Peru, there might be an opening for a middle ground, namely the transaction of voluntary offsets under an Article 6 agreement. May I have the next slide, please? So if you look at the implementation agreement, it very clearly states in the objective that other mitigation purposes are meant with the provisions. So it's not only about transferring mitigation outcomes for the achievement of the Swiss NDC, but also other mitigation purposes by private entities, which means this is these units would come with corresponding adjustment, because this is in the core of the agreement that Peru will do corresponding adjustments. Next slide. At the perspective of the voluntary market, it's a market. The invisible hands will basically rule the allocation, and based on the buyer preferences, and this you know much better than I do. They will look at the costs, at the unit costs. They will look at the story, what co-benefits are there, and of course they also will look at the corresponding adjustments. Do the units have corresponding adjustment or not? And of course credibility of the standard. And here a question into the room: is there a potential for crowding out the compliance market against that backdrop of fragmented market, and most probably also a kind of a constrained supply for mitigation activities as such? And once developers have to decide which market they should address, there is a rational it could be a rational choice to develop into the most promising markets, which is not the compliance market. So that's it.
Yeah, thank you very much, Misha. I see some questions queuing up in the question and answer stream, but those I will keep for the general discussion because they are generic. Are there any clarification questions immediately? I'm currently not seeing any hand, so I would now invite Patrick to give his view from the NGO perspective. Patrick, you have the floor.
Thank you. And Johanna, I'm not host anymore, so I can't show. So either you show or give me the co-hosting rights.
I hope the technology question can be resolved.
And of course, I'm going to talk about the beyond Kyoto. It's only 3 weeks away, yes, that we kind of leave this period and start a new era. And we have asked ourselves, what are companies going to do with this new situation, and what respect this might change the situation they find themselves. And that's what I'm going to talk
Perfect.
about.
So the slides are coming up. I see at least something happening. So just bear with us. Yes.
Okay. Does this work now?
Yes.
Great. So, and leaving Kyoto-period behind means also that we leave behind a situation where, at least in an ex-post analysis, the additionality has been really low and poor. Of course, we know well that it's always easy and also the stakeholders were not aware of this situation. And of course, this is not helpful either. And then, at least in the second period of the Kyoto period, the demand was low. The compliance market didn't really ask for a lot of a black picture of the past, but I think that's really a good starting point to think about the future and how much brighter this should become. And why do we need the voluntary markets? This is just the usual graphic from the today released emissions gap report, and as we have seen, the mitigation and ambition gap is still huge. So the governments are not delivering what we need. So we need additional actors, and so the voluntary market potentially has a contribution to do in this field. And we believe from WWF that one part of that gap can actually be filled also by nature-based solutions, forestry, agriculture, wetlands. The potentials shown here are not our own estimates, so those may be potentials on the paper, very hard to realize. We are aware of that. They are also not permanent in nature. We have a lot of problems with leakage, but still we believe we actually need to go into these projects. We need to do that. We need to get finance to do them. And also look into the co-benefits for nature that we can realize going that way down. Now, this contradicts a little bit with my first analysis, and therefore we propose actually to prioritize two major pathways for the voluntary carbon market, also to make things maybe hopefully more simple and understandable to corporates. We think that either you want to top the NDC pledges, so you go with Article 6, you do the corresponding adjustments, you reduce the risks of overselling, you provide share of proceeds, you do the overall mitigation in global emissions by canceling some of the reductions you achieved. You still look to maximize the co-benefits, and you also make sure that you manage to give good incentives to the enhancement of the NDCs, being it in scope or quality or ambition. I think all the three are relevant as well. The other option is actually to go into really the climate finance, to do financial contributions. This means you do contribution claims, of course, not offsetting claims anymore. Those projects have to follow high quality again. So you need a result-based finance and a framework and standardization and certification of that. So it's not like a Wild West situation. And this is really the place where nature-based solutions can come in and play a major role. We have, as I mentioned, developed a framework for corporates that we think fits pretty well in the Paris area. And of course, this starts with accounting and disclosing the value chain emissions, and then using the science-based target methodology for 1.5 degrees and once they have done that, then they can go further. And we suggest that they actually translate their remaining emissions into financial commitments and basically using the social cost of carbon approach. In Switzerland, we have the government that calculates year by year this social cost of carbon, and it's something like between 150 and 200 Swiss francs for the coming decade per ton of CO2. So this would be the cash that goes into it, and this cash can then be used to actually reduce emissions beyond the science-based targets, so internally within scope 1, 2, and 3. But it can also be used externally to unlock climate solutions, to do either investments in landscape finance. This is where also nature-based solutions come into it with all the co-benefits attached, but they can also go in climate innovation. Further, they can be invested, as I mentioned with option 1 before, in high quality credits, in mitigation outcomes, and probably it's a good way to separate reductions from removals in that accounting scheme. And finally, also investments in adaptation measures could be part of that investment portfolio. So this is the investment part we see as essential also to fulfill the different needs within the Paris Agreement. But then we need more, because if only the forefront players do all this but others need to be also pushed by policy, so to influence climate policies. Second very important field where they could go, and that in our view is fully compatible with the Paris Agreement. Now, companies always ask, well, and how can I sell this to my customers and stakeholders and so on? And we actually think that for the time being, we need to go back in terms of claims and to head for transparent, true, and achievable claims, to be as precise as possible when we say what we do. So if we do mitigation, that we are clear what we are doing. Important. That's we do not yet offer, but we intend actually to offer is as accurate as possible, but also catchy marketing claims. And so this still has to be developed, and that's a task we take very serious, and that has a high priority right now within WWF. What WWF Switzerland does not like at all is the actual situation where most companies, it doesn't matter what they do, they claim climate neutrality. It's very popular, but in our view also very misleading. This neutralizing, if you look into what they do, usually doesn't really hold, for one reason is that they use temporary credits as permanent ones, and also the leakage issue is very hard to avoid. Also, carbon neutrality, at least in the German-speaking world, suggests that there is something like no footprint at all. So it helps to spur overconsumption, which is not something we would support. So we suggest to avoid actually this claim in starting next year, as any other claims that suggest a one-to-one offsetting without really delivering what they promise. So to summarize, we want to create greener but also much larger pastures, and to do this now, not wait for another few years. So restart the Paris period, leaving the Kyoto mess behind. Use the rising public and corporate interest in climate wisely with truthful and verifiable claims, to advocate to internalize external costs, so to use this social cost of carbon approach when finance commitments are decided, and of course finally to refocus on the transition and the big wins rather than just cheap credits. Thank you very much.
Yes, thanks a lot, Patrick. So are there any clarification questions? There were a few questions coming both through chat and question and answers, but all of these are generic and not clarifications. So I don't see any hand up right now. So I would pass the floor to Jochen and give the view of a big provider of voluntary offsets. Jochen, you have the floor.
Thank you, Axel, and thank you for inviting me to speak. Johanna, if you could please bring up my slides. No, perhaps while Johanna is working on that, on your starting question, whether the pastures are greener in voluntary than in compliance, that's hard to answer, I think. But clearly, the perspective of a market actor in the voluntary market is that the pastures in the voluntary market are greener today than they were 5 to 10 years ago. That is clear. But also we are in a situation where the outlook is, wrought with uncertainties. So I will, and a lot has been said by my fellow presenters already. So I'll focus on discussing a couple of key trends in the market where they have been touched already by fellow speakers. I'll be brief to not discuss topics twice. If you could go to the next slide, Johanna, please. So what you see from this slide is, and to the left, you see the historical developments of retirements. These graphs are taken from Trove Research. You see a growing market, albeit at a relatively small level. The market will likely have seen up to 80 million carbon credits retired for voluntary purposes. From the color coding, you see that the majority of these volumes come from renewable energy and RED Plus projects. You also see consistent growth over the last, say, 12 years. We definitely have seen growth increase over the last 3 to 4 years with new buyers coming on the market, a shift from only low carbon intensity businesses to medium carbon intensity, high carbon intensity businesses coming on the market as buyers. Jeff, representing BP, will certainly talk about this as well. So this is the historical view of the market. So growth, the right hand side shows potential scenarios for the future, and it's really hard to predict where the voluntary market is going to go post 2030. But when we look at the corporate commitments that are on the table now, and then they definitely reach until 2030. I think, you know, if we get the market infrastructure right, so that it can deliver what the buyers want, significant growth can be expected for the next 10 years. Another graph here shows a 6 to 10 times growth up until 2030. I think that is not completely unrealistic. Beyond 2030 is really hard to say. Next slide, please. What seems to, you know, become the guiding concept for at least large corporates taking action is net zero by science-based targets. Patrick has spoken about SBTi. Net zero by SBTi puts forward a couple of scenarios of, you know, being in line with the Paris Agreement. To the left, you see the emissions abatement scenario. So you only, well, you reduce without using, say, market-based mechanisms. The middle scenario is called the climate positive approach, where you reduce, and while you reduce, you compensate the remaining emissions along the way. And then in the end, you reach a point where your remaining emissions, if there are remaining emissions, are neutralized. Important to note that SBTi here differentiates between compensation, which is, if you like, offsetting with emission reductions, and neutralization, which is the use of carbon dioxide removals. So the ask here is that at your target year, as a corporate, you use carbon dioxide removals and not carbon credits from reductions. The scenario on the right shows a path where only carbon dioxide removal is used, and a portfolio of, you know, carbon dioxide removal credits or products are being applied on a growing scale over the science-based target trajectory. Now, what this initiative does basically is, on the one hand, it forces corporates to think long term, which is good. That is a change from the last 10 years, where the voluntary market has mainly functioned as a spot market, where corporates were buying supply off the market, not thinking about, you know, future years too much. SBTi and net zero under SBTi forces corporates to think over 10, 15 years and plan their reductions and plan their offsetting or neutralization long term, which also means that on the back of that initiative, the implementation, the generation of future supply can grow, right? The second thing that net zero does is that it shifts the focus slightly, I would say, from reductions to carbon dioxide removals, which is not a bad thing, but is not something that, as it stands, the market can really deliver. The availability of carbon dioxide removals in the market is still low, and I would say the necessity for reductions is still very high. We can't possibly not reduce and only apply carbon sinks to save the climate. Next slide, please. Owen has mentioned the task force on scaling the voluntary carbon market. Now, the objective of that task force, initiated by Mark Carney, chaired by the CEO of Standard Chartered, and managed or administered by McKinsey, is to create a larger, more transparent, more commoditized carbon market, a voluntary carbon market, on the basis of a set of what is called core carbon principles. Think of this as, you know, standard criteria that we all know: real, measurable, verified, and permanent emission reductions, plus a generation of core carbon reference contracts that can then be traded on liquid markets. You may want to look at this as something very similar to the CDM with a primary and a secondary market, or as it applies a multitude of standards, CORSIA, but so far without the requirement for corresponding adjustments. Next slide, please. There will be higher competition for shrinking supply. Obviously, the voluntary market is not the only game in town. There is an increasing share of global emissions that are, regulated. The NDCs will have an increasing scope. There may be other compliance regimes on a national or international scale, such as CORSIA. So more competition, less supply, rising prices is kind of the outlook for the 2020 to 2030. Next slide, please. The big question, obviously, the elephant in the room is how does the voluntary market interact with the compliance market, and are corresponding adjustments necessary? The key questions there are what is the scope that remains for the voluntary market? Will it undermine, or is there a risk of undermining host country ambition? Is there a risk of double counting? And what can the claims credibly be that we apply? These points have been discussed by Patrick and Owen before. Now, while we think it can be argued that no double counting actually occurs without corresponding adjustments, and ambition isn't necessarily undermined by the voluntary market, especially when it is small as it is today. What cannot be argued at the moment is that the infrastructure that is required for corresponding adjustments is not in place and will not be for the years to come. So what we'll need is thoughtful transition, picking up Owen's words here, and we'd very much advocate for that. The market is booming. We cannot possibly have it fall off a cliff. And to my last slide, Axel, please, if you accord me another 20 seconds. Please. So opportunities and challenges, just to sum this up, we've got growing demand versus increased competition for shrinking supply in the future. We've got long-term net zero strategies versus a market that is currently a spot market with limited risk capital for the generation of future supply. So financing is an issue. Long-term pricing is an issue. We've got demand for carbon dioxide removals, which is kind of the project type du jour at the moment, versus limited availability of these, comparatively high prices, long lead times. I may want to add the risk of permanence and a continued need for reduction. We've got commoditization versus demand for bespoke projects with above average benefits. And we've got a call for corresponding adjustments versus a disagreement over the necessity and serious concerns about practicability, at least as it stands today. I would pick up Owen's arguments that all this calls for transition periods on corresponding adjustments, transition periods for carbon dioxide removals and the like. We need to think of the next couple of years as transition periods for this market to a desired end state or perfect state further down the line. That's it. Thanks.
Yes, thank you very much. I have one clarification and a question from Ben, but let's start with Misha's clarification. Misha, do you want to bring it? Misha Repman. Misha, you have the floor for your clarification. Okay, there seems to be some technical issues.
I can read Misha's question. So the scenarios that I've shown are illustrative. Now, what the net zero guidance from SBTi does, and it is very much a draft document, I would say, at the moment, that needs further refinement, which is expected early in the year, is that it lays out these scenarios and then it ranks them. And Misha is right. Not all of them are ranked equally high. That is true. This was more, my slide was more for all illustrative purposes. and not to say that all of these are of equal quality with regards to, Paris Agreement compliance and environmental integrity.
Good, thanks, Jochen. I see that Ben has also stated that his question has been answered. So then I would like to pass to Jeff, last but not least. And of course, BP is a big player. So I'm looking forward to Ben's input.
Thanks, Axel. Thank you very much.
Jeff. Yeah,
thank you.
Please.
And thanks to you and Misha for the invitation. So I'm really pleased to be here. I have some slides. I only have 3. So I think many people probably slide it out by now. So I'll just go through those if that's great. Looks like we're on the way there. So I'm BP's lead climate advisor. And if you weren't aware already, BP set out in February a new ambition and a new strategy to become a net zero company by 2050, if not sooner. So the team I'm in is to help figure that out and to deliver and lead by example to do that. There are around 5 aims that BP has to help the company get to net zero by that date, if not sooner. I'm happy to ask questions about those. You can also find them on the website, but they address not only BP's scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, but also its scope 3 emissions. And those aims are not the end all. They're going to evolve over time. But the important thing, I think, for this conversation is that BP doesn't plan on relying on using offsets to meet those aims. We will use other measures to deliver those goals. We will use offsets to meet the aims when we need to do so for compliance reasons in various businesses. But offsets aren't going to be a primary way or a major way that we'll rely on delivering those aims and those ambitions. But instead, we hope that they can help BP go beyond these goals and help the world get towards net zero as well. So that's the entry point for us into this conversation. Whilst we don't anticipate on relying on offsets to meet our own goals, we think that they're an important tool to help the world get towards a net zero by mid-century, if not sooner. So the exam question that Axel kindly raised was, what's more interesting right now, voluntary or compliance carbon markets? So I've got a slide on each of them. I think they're both very important and very critical, but I'd like to walk you through my perspective on each of those. So if we could just go to the next slide, please. So voluntary carbon markets can definitely help us get towards net zero. They're an effective tool to do so. I think the main arena or the main stage of this market right now is major businesses offsetting their scope 3 emissions in order to help them become either net zero or to reduce their corporate voluntary emission reduction targets. And I totally understand and a lot of what Patrick mentioned earlier resonates with me, because I think the marketplace is all over the place with how this is being done. And in a lot of ways, offsetting scope 3 is becoming mainstream. Definitely here in Europe, we're starting to see more of that in other parts of the world. So we need to grow the market and make sure that the market is operating on sound principles which are transparent. And Jochen was just referencing where a lot of that will come from through this new task force on voluntary carbon markets. I think there's definitely healthy competition amongst many major European companies to now exceed each other on net zero commitments. Axel mentioned this net zero target stampede. I think that's great. I think it's healthy. I think this is what we need to see, and we need to put pressure on companies to lead by example, to operate faster than regulation in terms of reducing emissions and setting these commitments. Some of those companies are relying on offsets for this, some are not. And irrespective of that, that's definitely boosting demand for voluntary offsets all over the world. And then in addition to these corporate commitments, you're also starting to see customer sales platforms offering purchases to be carbon neutral. You see this at petrol stations. We have that here in the UK now. You also see it with online wine shops. So my local wine shop here in London, which definitely helped me get through the first and second lockdown, offers to make all my purchases carbon neutral. They use offsets for that. And it's just becoming way more mainstream. I think we all see that in our daily lives now, wherever we're making purchases. I think the other important thing around voluntary markets, and obviously Owen is the thought leader here, is on their co-benefits and making sure that offsets, also address additional UN Sustainable Development Goals, and also on biodiversity, water, grasslands. That's what gets me really excited. BP is going to make some announcements on this in the coming months, so watch this space, particularly around natural climate solutions. And then the voluntary carbon markets, I think, have always and should continue to lead by example in terms of infrastructure related to monitoring, reporting, and verification, how to reduce emissions in hard to abate sectors, and really setting the infrastructure for how we can really reduce emissions at scale. And I think a lot of the recent task force on voluntary carbon markets shows that. So there's some great recommendations on digital MRV infrastructure, which we really support at BP, particularly in the space of natural climate solutions. So I think voluntary carbon markets are essential in order to get the world to net zero. And they're really important to innovate and to set example and help identify areas where policymakers could come in and set up compliance carbon markets, but they're not the only tool. And they need to be supported by strong principles, governance, and transparency. And that's why I'm so excited about the recommendations from the Mark Carney-led task force on voluntary carbon markets, which we support and we're a member of. So what does that mean in terms of compliance carbon markets? And the next slide will hopefully show some examples of that. So in my view, compliance carbon markets can help reduce emissions at scale if they're designed effectively. Economy-wide, well-designed carbon pricing should be the most efficient way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. This is important because efficiency should lead to lower costs and a better chance of maintaining political support in order to get towards net zero. There's actually a paper that came out from the EBRD today on this very topic around how the increase of carbon markets around the world can also help countries achieve those targets at cost, and hopefully achieving them at cost will help us all work towards net zero when government budgets are constrained as we embark on this huge economic recovery and public health journey that we're all living through at this moment in time. I think we need to look at how carbon markets can be effective at cost in order for governments to have budgets to deal with other major public policy issues. And ideally, carbon markets, carbon pricing should provide the right incentives for everybody, not just energy companies, but also consumers to play their part in reducing emissions. Certainly, energy companies need to pay and address the full cost of pollution, but we need to look at this across the entire economy. And that's why some of the interesting things that are coming out in the ETS here in Europe are really interesting to follow. We're now finally getting to a point where emissions across the entire European economy will hopefully be accounted for and will also hopefully be included in terms of payment for pollution. And as we embark on that and economy-wide carbon pricing finally comes to fruition, not just here in Europe, but in other parts of the world, we hopefully will see emissions reduced at scale. And that will hopefully also get us towards net zero faster than we anticipate. An important issue as well is that compliance carbon markets, I think, drive scale and liquidity faster than in voluntary markets. having an obligation to report, reduce, and pay for your carbon is completely different from having to do so voluntarily. And that ultimately, drives the scale and liquidity that we need in order to make sure that these markets are effective. And then I think a really critical thing that voluntary carbon markets might not necessarily have done so as effectively as they could have been in the past, and certainly compliance carbon markets haven't done so either, is to make sure that the most vulnerable in society are addressed when these policies emerge. We need to make sure that as we embark on economy-wide compliance carbon markets, the most vulnerable aren't affected. And that's going to be a really, really important issue as we move towards economy-wide carbon pricing. The most vulnerable shouldn't have to pay for this, and we need to make sure that that's embedded in policy design. And then my last point is that compliance carbon markets can definitely help us to get to net zero if they're designed effectively, but they're not the only tool. And we're going to need to rely on other technologies and other policies in order to help us get there, particularly in hard to abate sectors like transportation and industrial emissions. So I hope that was some helpful food from thought and not too many slides. And again, thank you very much, Axel and Misha and all of you for the invitation.
Thanks a lot, Jeff, for really taking up the challenge and answering it in a very neat fashion. Apparently, we had a problem with the technology because it seems that people who wanted to ask questions could not, and therefore I've now a piled up list of questions. I hope that my colleagues working on the technology will now be able to unmute people for the general discussion, but I would like to consider those questions that came in first through writing. So I'll just go through them and then open for the rest of the audience. So I had very early question coming from Anton Roth. How do you see emerging technologies such as direct air capture affecting carbon offsetting? So of course, we've heard some of the presentations looking at that, but if one or two of you want to give a comment on that, of course, it would be appreciated. Anyone wanting to have a stab at this? Yes, Patrick, please.
Well, I can just say two kind of obvious things. And on the first hand, it's acting on the market like a backstop technology. So it's kind of setting the price roof where the carbon market most likely will not go beyond. And then, of course, when I listen to all the presenters, I hear a lot of fear that the liquidity will not be there, the supply is not there, and of course this could potentially help with the supply, but then it's really a question of the market prices, I guess. So that have been two very obvious answers. Sorry for that.
Yeah, thanks. Anyone else who wants to come in on that? If not, I'll go over to Matt Spanigal, who asked, to what extent are CDM methodologies relevant for future ITMOs? Well, CDM has seen a patchy record, at least here on our panel. I would have my own opinions also, but yeah, anyone who wants to get into the CDM methodology question from the panel?
Maybe I'd cover that. So yeah. It's quite plain that it's not only a question about CDM, but also other methodologies that are used as a vector for mitigation outcomes transferred under Article 6. Article 6 transactions are voluntary. I mean, voluntary between the two countries, and the transferring country has to agree on the authorization of the activity itself, but also of the transactions. So with that, the countries have basically sovereignty on the methodology. And in any case, the step of the authorization requires like a translation of the methodology into the context of the Article 6 setting. So in any case, there will be no direct transfer of outcomes of units but they need to be like registered under the bilateral agreement or under the agreement whatsoever, in order to let the transferring country the units go out or be transferred out. And in that context, maybe it was also mentioned or alluded to the question on human rights and sustainable development. Our experience is that transferring countries, they stick on their prerogative to interpret what sustainable development and human rights mean in the context of the country. So there will be quite some discussions around that if you use the voluntary standards that are implemented or are developed for Article 6 purposes in that respect. There needs to be a retranslation into the national context.
Thanks, Misha. I see Perumal.
Yeah, thanks.
Please.
Yeah, a few comments from my side. I think, yeah, I agree with Misha that when you attribute that as an ITMO, but I see that the CDM methodologies were basically quantifying certified emission reductions. And my understanding of the question was that would the CDM methodologies would be in a position to create mitigation outcomes. Like, I'm not assigning IT to that, the internationally transferred. In terms of mitigation outcomes, there do like the scope of the Article 6 may include varied types. Like, as we know that in the current CDM, we are mostly on the project activity based. But the current Article 6.4 text largely talking about activity types, but it does not disregard the other types of activity scopes, namely the sectoral or the policy crediting, etc. And then the baseline principles and the approaches are being currently negotiated under Article 6.4. And some of the baseline approaches do mirror what is there in the CDM. So if the question is that whether the CDM methodologies can be taken off the shelf and applied immediately under Article 6.4, depending on how the rules related to the principles and the approaches towards the baseline are determined, would in fact determine how they would be directly applied. But at an activity level, the methodologies do have multiple components, and one of the components related to the monitoring of emissions or project emissions or calculating these emission reductions are going to be predominantly the same if we are going to have activity level crediting under the Article 6. So one of the major components that would need is that the new supervisory body or the SUBSTA or the CMA has to come forward with a guidance on how to treat the domestic policies while determining the baseline as an overarching principle. And once that principle is there, these methodologies would need a kind of a tailor-made, it has to be tailor-made to fit the current Article 6 scenario, and then these methodologies could be used. So I would say that it would be used, but it needs some kind of a modification based on the approaches that would be determined by the Article 6 supervisory body, and also how the national policies would intervene in defining the baseline in comparison to how we were determining baseline under the CDM. Thanks.
Thanks, Perumal. I now have a question by Lena Hörnlein. Lena, do you want to ask a question? I think now the microphone should be on. Lena, you have the floor.
Okay, so my question was, there seemed to be certain, the understanding that the voluntary markets are more attractive at the moment. And I wanted to know, or yeah, at least I think Misha, you referred to that. I wanted to know whether you think that this also holds in the context of these bilateral agreements between Switzerland and Peru, for example, or maybe we'll see others in the future. And if yes, why or why not? Maybe other panelists also want to say something, but maybe Misha is also in a good position to answer. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Of course, it I showed a bit of a provocative and tainted picture. I mean, we are positive to reach our compliance goal, but we see there is a long road in front of us, and this road comes with a lot of unclarities with respect to how is market going to pick up. I mean, we are a bit in a different position than the voluntary market. We are the demand, and we are wondering about the supply. And currently, as I said, there are a lot of unclarities. The Peruvian registry regulations are not published yet. Switzerland will only be from January 2021 onwards in the position to do authorization because of the legal process. So it will take quite some time, and my hope or the direction or my vision, the direction in which we are working is to establish standards, so to say, like establish our blueprints for that work in a multitude of settings with respect to nesting, baseline setting, everything, and that this can be repeated on a large scale. So this is where we want to go, and then of course the participation also of private actors will be easy, but we have to get there.
Jochen, please.
So perhaps to try and provide a more general answer to the question of, you know, which markets are more attractive. I think, you know, that really depends what opportunities the different, you know, segments present to the project owners or project developers. And we've seen in the recent past that compliance regimes such as the Colombian carbon tax can generate a lot of supply at a reasonably low cost of the carbon tax. We've seen that a compliance regime, namely CORSIA, has not yet proven to, you know, generate the offtake and spur the development of new supply. We've seen high-priced systems such as the Korean ETS and a lot of, you know, a number of high-quality projects have been developed for the Korean ETS. Now, with uncertainty about CERs, these same projects are now looking to the voluntary market to sell their offset. So it really depends. We'll have quite a patchwork, and project developers will just, you know, will apply different strategies. Either they will lock themselves in one or the other market, or they will keep their options open. That kind of leads back to the to Owen's presentation that, you know, they will just generate emission reductions, and then depending on the use and depending on where the biggest opportunity is, they will kind of turn them into CORSIA grade or Colombia grade or South Africa grade or voluntary grade, right? I think that is the future. And it's very hard to say today what the overall picture will be 5 to 10 years from now.
Yeah, thanks, Jochen. So
Axel, could I
yes.
just answer that question very, very quickly? Because I think it depends on what is your definition of interesting. And, you know, for me, neither are interesting at the moment because they're not leading to major technological shifts. You know, we're in a situation where carbon offset prices, carbon prices, you know, at best, you know, 20, 25 euros in the EU ETS. You know, I think there's something similar to that in Korea, but neither of them, and neither are you seeing in the voluntary carbon markets, prices high enough for us to get up higher in the abatement chain in order to get us towards new technologies that are really reducing emissions at large scale that's going to deliver net zero. So for me, if you answer the question, or you ask the question in that frame, I don't think either of them are very interesting. But I think if you want to ask the question about interest in terms of liquidity and scalability, you get a different answer. But I think that's the most provocative way of asking the question.
Thanks, Jeff. Now I would like to go to the next question. Karl Ulrich, you have the floor.
Thanks. I couldn't keep up with the additionality discussion. So what is the status there today? Will it be further required or not?
Well, very interesting. I would have my views on this. But of course, the panel is asked first.
Yeah, very short question. Answer, yes. It will be requested through the bylaw of the Swiss regulation post 21. There will be a provision that says something like that the activity must not be financially viable without the support of the carbon markets. That will be a provision in the national bylaw of Switzerland, and we have to keep it in under the stick to this under the compliance regime, although it's not quite clear how this will be dealt with in the end.
Thanks, Misha. Maybe I'll give my few cents on this. I think in a world where the NDCs may have hot airs and inflated baselines, additionality is indispensable. Good. So let's go to Regina. Regina, you have the floor.
Yeah, I was just wondering, there was one from Jochen where he showed what the retirements were in the voluntary market. And I was wondering what share were CDMs, which were voluntary cancelled, and what are other units which are retired. And in this way, I would like to see how your graph and the graphs we've seen from Sana earlier on, where she also gave some figures on what has been voluntary cancelled, you know, how they match. Maybe you could give us a hint on that. And maybe one other question, is there any possibility to hold CDMs outside any of the UNFCCC registries? Like, can anybody in a voluntary market put them somewhere where they wouldn't be reported under, you know, UNFCCC reporting requirements? Is there a registry where you could move them, or do they have to stick within, you know, the party registries?
Thanks, Regina. Technical questions of high importance. Jochen, could you clarify on the numbers?
I can take the first one, Sana, if you take the second part. Now, I'm not quite sure I recall Sana's numbers, but from what I think I recall, it was the voluntary cancellations from the CDM were in the single-digit million tons per year. If you compare that to the 80 million tons retired in the voluntary market overall, it may be somewhere. It may be that, you know, out of that 80 million, somewhere between 5 and 10% are CERs. The rest would be VERs, and that is also, I would say, you know, the sense of the market we have here. The lion's share of the buyers are currently looking for VERs to do their carbon offsetting, and a smaller share are looking to CERs. And that's not going to increase with all the uncertainty about the CDM, obviously.
Thanks, Jochen. Just a short comment on these numbers. Actually, if one has looked at the series of the reports that come from Forest Ecosystems Marketplace, these gave much higher numbers for the early years of the voluntary market. So I would say that these numbers that you've shown are overestimating the rise of the voluntary market, because the definitions can be debated. I would like to give Sana the possibility to answer the second part of Regina's question.
Thank you, Axel. I'll just confirm what Jochen said, that the cancellations in the CDM registry, which are purely for voluntary purposes, are in the range of 7 million this year, this 2020 year. I want to take the quick opportunity to once again clarify that the voluntary cancellation in the CDM registry is primarily used as a pathway for linking the mitigation outcomes to the compliance regimes of the countries, mostly Korea, Colombia, and South Africa, which implement them. In terms of the question on where the CERs that could be used for voluntary cancellation have to be held, they can only be held in the Kyoto registry systems, whether it be national registries or the CDM registry. The CDM registry is very opaque in the sense that it's not really a trading registry. We just sort of a program registry which creates the units, and then we forward them to the emissions trading national registries of Annex 1 parties. But what I would certainly probably do here is I would separate the holding element from the reporting element. For as long as the registries which can hold CERs can enable that voluntary cancellation also has the corresponding transparency around that, the purposes for which the units are cancelled, they shouldn't be a great challenge. But on the other hand, the national registries of Annex 1 parties are also not necessarily entirely open and easily accessible by market participants, in contrast to the registry systems I understand of voluntary schemes are. So in that respect, the CDM registry is not, the CERs are not so easy to access by certain participants in the voluntary market. Thanks, Axel.
Thank you, Sana. Now the next is Juliette. You have the floor.
Hi, thanks very much. Juliette, working at WWF Germany. It was more of a comment than a question. It was a reaction to BP presentation. I was kind of struck by the framing. You said that offsetting can make a major contribution to companies' reduction. And my experience from the Kyoto Protocol, it was at best a zero-sum game. And as Patrick said, most of the case, it was not even a zero-sum game. It led to more emissions, actually. And for us, the Paris Agreement is a game changer in the way that all countries are now covered by an NDCs and have to do their homework. And this means that this traditional zero-sum game is not acceptable, or is not part of the solution at all. And I just wanted to have you clarify on this, whether you think that the Paris Agreement is making a shift also on the carbon markets, or whether you think we basically go business as usual.
So who would like to take this one?
Maybe I could start with
Yes.
that, Axel, because she
Yeah.
Referred to VP. So I think it might have been a misinterpretation of the slides. So my point was that more and more companies are demanding offsets in the voluntary market in order to reduce their scope 3 emissions, and in order to fulfill whatever voluntary commitments they might have set. So that was the point of the slide, and that was also why the exam question is, what's interesting, voluntary markets or compliance carbon markets? And that was also why my conclusion was compliance carbon markets are way more interesting, because it's way more important to have an obligation than to do something just voluntarily. Yeah.
Thanks, Jeff. I have Simon. Simon, you have the floor.
Great, thanks, Axel. Thanks for the great presentation. This is Simon from the Swiss government. Yeah, so what's more interesting, and is it really different, the compliance and voluntary market? I think sometimes, and that goes a bit in the direction of what Owen said, it will eventually, and maybe already quite early on, go in the same direction and have the same criteria. Maybe one example is seeing on the one side Misha, that will have to comply with the Swiss CO2 law and its details, and in the same fashion what the Swiss government will do in voluntary offsetting, which obviously you can't say, Misha, please do that, but we're going to do something completely different. And I think one of those key criteria is, of course, the double counting avoidance. And so I think we can take this as one example where in the voluntary space, there is someone that will demand this. And so Misha already spoke to the fact that the bilateral agreement between Switzerland and Peru does foresee that possibility to also have a transfer for other purposes that may not be NDC use. But I have a question primarily, well, to the project developers, so maybe Jochen, and also other big buyers that are interested in incredible units, seeing that difficulty of having units that do avoid double counting, so that do have corresponding adjustment. It was stated many times that's very difficult to get them. But I'm wondering, is there any plan to get there? Where do you see potential pathways for project developers, but also for buyers? As this is a question I think many institutions, CORSIA and so on and so forth, will be asking. And I guess, how much demand have you already seen from your end consumer in saying, well, this is really important to me. How can I get this? Thank you.
Thanks, Simon. Anyone who wants to address this, especially now from the private sector?
Should I take
yes, please.
The last part of the statement? And Owen, please chime in. You kind of disappeared from the video screen here, so I just wanted to refer to what you said. So Simon, there's a few things here. I mean, obviously corresponding adjustments are not available yet in the order of magnitude that we'll need them, and it's unlikely we'll see sufficient amount of corresponding adjustments commensurate to the demand of the voluntary market. Now, for corporate buyers, avoiding double counting is obviously essential. So in you know, for them there is basically two strategies at the moment. Define a transition period during which you still rely on Kyoto credits. Now, carbon offsetting relies on historical credits, right? You compensate the emissions of year N with the emission reductions of years N minus 1, 2, 3. So that provides corporates with a certain transition period. And then the gold standards transition period comes in, which gives another leeway, so to say, as you know, it is not planned to require corresponding adjustments for all project types, from all countries from day one. So you can define that transition period as a start, and the other approach would be to just live with, you know, the risk. I mean, some of the oil companies that we are working with are building their portfolios solely on, you know, in-house or for them developed projects, and they clearly take the risk of, you know, developing post 2020 emission reductions that, you know, in the end could come without corresponding adjustments. You'll have to monitor that. You'll have to select countries and projects very carefully, but you'll not get certainty anytime soon.
Thanks, Jochen. I still have a number of questions, so I hope there's some appetite to run a bit over the allotted time, because I would really give justice to those who asked questions and also taking note of the technical difficulties. So now I will give the floor to Jörg. Jörg, please.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. So this is Jörg Füßler from Infos, and I'm really enjoying this event, seeing all your faces. That's really great. I have a question about your outlook, about the prospects of the carbon markets in the next decades. Jochen, you've shown a really striking slide where you plot a huge increase in the role of carbon markets until the end of the century. And for me, that goes a bit against, for instance, modeling work that IETA has done, where they show that under a reasonable global decarbonization scenario, where all the countries go to minus 80% by the end of the century, the carbon prices is astonishingly quickly converged to about $300 per ton in like 2040. So this would mean that soon there will not be a huge difference in the marginal costs between different countries, basically because all larger countries at least they have to do their own decarbonization. So with that, I would see more short-term temporary role for carbon markets, except of course negative emission technologies, which then would need to kick in. But is that also your view, or do you think that you can still sell lots of ITMOs in 2050 or 2060?
Thanks, Jörg. Anyone who wants to take it up?
Let me say just one sentence. I don't want to take up the whole speaking time. So I'll really just one sentence and then somebody else. Jörg, I've also said that I looking at the future. I'm reasonably confident that if we get this market right until 2030, we'll see rising demand and the growth of the market. I wouldn't adventure as far as saying that I can predict the market beyond that. And I'm with you that in the end we'll see removals and not offsetting.
Thanks, Jochen. Anyone else among the panelists? I would have by 2 cents. I think that these overestimates, especially the high end of the task force for 2050, is way above the top. I can't see how this could happen, especially if the governments get their grip on the NDC world. And I don't see, from my 25 years experience in the field, how you would see a massive action on the private sector without action on the government level. Private sector action is looking nice these days, but I've lived through periods where the private sector was just sitting on the fence waiting for governments to take the lead. So yeah, how stable this current fashion of private sector to engage is remains to be seen. Yeah, Ben has a question. So Ben, you have the floor.
Yeah, hi, thanks, Axel. It was largely responded to by Jochen in the previous answer, but it raises some concerns, I suppose. So I wanted to ask, like, with all the uncertainty about what happens with corresponding adjustments, do the panelists believe this is going to deter voluntary buyers from seeking out the newer activities, and they'll focus on older vintages, which kind of has its own issues for what we're trying to do on climate action?
So anyone who wants to?
Yeah, Axel, happy to say a few words on that one.
Yeah.
I think, Ben, in terms of buyers being deterred, I think there's that sort of part of the equation. There's also, will project developers themselves be concerned about investing? After all, they're seeking speculative finance themselves. I guess with something like corresponding adjustments, eventually it will catch on and become clear that the maths don't really work if it's double claimed with the host country. It's not a preference thing. It's just a maths problem. If I offset my emissions and somebody else claims the same credit, I can't be sure how they acted to that signal. They may keep their emissions the same or grow them. They may reduce them. They may go, great, let's take that signal. And to me, something like the South Africa carbon tax is one where you can be more confident, at least the government is aware of all parts of the signal and should be planning accordingly. Whether they are or not, obviously, is another question. But with that uncertainty, that will at some point, you would assume, become clearer, or at least you don't want to wake up in 5 years' time as a buyer, who's invested a lot in this part of their strategy and find a WWF or a Greenpeace or somebody, doing the maths and realizing you've made no difference, as Patrick has been able to show and others have been able to show from parts of the CDM. So we have to be kind of cognizant of that. So it's kind of a two-edged sword, that, isn't it? There's a deterrent and a risk in not doing it, and I think that's why we would point to a thoughtful transition to get there, while we all figure out the infrastructure and the right way to do it. I would say on the pre-2016 credits, there was an interesting report, I think out yesterday or today, from Trove Research, talking about voluntary markets cutting off pre-2016 credits. I think, you know, there's some validity in that. Again, I think I would say we have to be a little bit careful to be stable and not, you know, not frighten the horses too much while the market is still trying to grow, coupled with environmental integrity. And the other part of that is not to throw away vulnerable projects that otherwise fail, because that's a fairly pointless endeavor as well. So I think some of these things either happen through market signal and market understanding. So, you know, even if we issued those credits, people might not buy them anymore. At least that's what I'd hope people start to catch on to. And then others are a case of, you know, rules effectively taking care of them. And I don't think that necessarily should sound like me putting a rule in place that cuts them off, but, you know, inevitably a combination of rules makes things, you know, makes the viability of some project types less and less likely, just through the need to renew things like additionality and update baseline, that kind of stuff. You know, eventually these externalities take care of those parts of the market, I guess. But yeah, it's certainly a two-edged sword. I'm sure Jochen is seeing that on the demand side as well as we are on the supply side.
Thanks, Owen. I still have two questions. I would like to let them answered if panelists are willing to stay on for a few minutes.
Well, Axel, may I add to this answer of Owen? Owen already mentioned kind of that I offered like this two-path approach with the finance contribution that resolves part of the problem. But since I've been looking a little bit into the emission gap report from today, just to remind us that the gap between conditional and unconditional NDCs is 3 gigatons. So there is also tons of space there. So go ahead.
No, I can only confirm this. And of course, I have been working on a lot of NDC revisions. And I can say that the countries are eager to get financing, but yeah, one cannot expect them to fulfill the conditional ones on their own. So I've Andrew Bonneau. You have the floor.
Thank you, Axel. Andrew here, previously worked at Biocarbon Engineering. I have a question in regards to the preference of corporate players. It seems that they're looking for additional certifications on top of just, you know, your standard offsets such as CCB. And I'm wondering, you know, as companies reach for net zero and they try to best each other, they may try to differentiate by having, let's say, higher quality offsets. And I'm curious how this is going to play out in relation to the compliance market. Could it be that the voluntary market pushes for more stringent certifications and standards that have these additional benefits? And, you know, what ramifications is that going to have on compliance markets in the future as the voluntary market continues to strive for greater impact? Thank you.
Okay, who wants to give a tap at this?
I'm happy to say a few. I mean, I think it's again, it's crystal ball stuff, isn't it? But I think we are starting to see at least uses of voluntary standards starting to aspire for higher integrity in environmental and sustainable development. Like I said earlier, I was pleased that CORSIA and the Mark Carney task force both call for provisions in sustainable development. But, you know, there's a big difference between calling for them and doing them well, that we still need to push for. I guess with a standard like ours as well, you know, we have the experience and the potential to label third-party units, and, you know, we've obviously done that in the context of CDM. You know, that fragments a little bit now, and we can look at 6.4 domestic schemes like China, for example. So I think we can, you know, as I say, the lines get blurred somewhat, the market fragments, but some of that good practice can cross those boundaries, I suspect. At least that would be my hope. Hard to know whether voluntary will outstrip compliance in wider integrity terms. Certainly we'll be pushing for that.
Yeah, thanks, Owen. Regina, sorry, your question is valid, but very technical. So maybe you can discuss it with Sana separately. I would give the floor to Ronaldo Teroa, please.
Thanks. Thanks to all the speakers for the excellent presentations. My question is very simple. Can the voluntary market, even in the 6.4 mechanism, deal with the leakage risk when we present credits from avoid deforestation projects? Even if you're using nasty jurisdictional approach, how can you be sure it can do all the the due diligence to make sure there will be no leakage, and then in that case creating climate integrity for the credits.
Yeah, thanks, Ronaldo. I think it's very important, and I'm sometimes really surprised how nature-based solutions are now the fashion of the day, whereas 20 years ago, the same institutions that are now clamoring for these were critically against them. So yeah, anyone wants to take a stab at this?
Yeah, sure, Axel. This is like, you know, kind of putting me on the spot. Thanks for that. I think you're completely right. I mean, there is no way to avoid leakage as long as we have globally net deforestation. To just look to the forests right now. So I think there is no way to avoid a leakage. There are very good ways to prevent that within jurisdictional boundaries, maybe within nations, but globally, I don't see how this works out. And this would restrict very much the project types under 6.4. The same applies to temporary reductions, which, for instance, Switzerland will exclude under 6.2. So that's also why we think that there is this other financial pathway really needed for these type of projects. So
thanks a lot, Patrick. Anyone else who wants to weigh in on this?
I would just second that, please. To be honest. Yeah, I fully agree. We've never believed and continue to feel the same, that any form of REDD+ is really suitable for voluntary markets or for offsetting, and it's a bubble, right? There's a lot of it in the market, and it's something that pains us a little bit, to be honest. Now, that's not to say market-based mechanisms couldn't support the finance for avoided deforestation, as Patrick said. It's just a different use of markets, but to me, not suitable for offsetting, and never has been. The other theme I think that's interesting is the rush to soil carbon, and to some extent, we've started down that road as well. I think actually we need to step back a little bit from even that and think of somebody like WRI's report, which says that we should focus on food security, intensifying production healthily, and reducing emissions and storing soil carbon as the co-benefit to that, or otherwise you're storing soil in agriculture forms that are just fundamentally misaligned with the climate emergency. So I think we sometimes get a bit obsessed with the impact unit and not the activity, and I think that's something that we need to take careful note of. Yeah.
Good, thanks. So I see Lena has her hand up, but I think we are now really already 10 minutes over time. So I think we should close now. I would really like to thank the panel for a very insightful discussion. The interest of almost having 50 people 10 minutes after time still with us shows that the interest was really big. I thoroughly enjoyed the discussion. I think this topic will keep us quite busy for a number of years, and we'll certainly have new elements and editions of this discussion in the context of the Zurich Carbon Market Association. So thank you everyone very much for a very interesting evening, and yeah, stay safe, have good end of the year, and hopefully see you back at the Zurich Carbon Market Association event next year. Thank you.
Thank you, Axel.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
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 Thank you.